I think I'm a special one.
Fabregas, lovely ball threaded through. Costa, what a start!
Frank Lampard to win it. He's got it.
He's done it! The greatest night in the history of Chelsea Football Club.
Hello there guys, Daniel Childs here once again. We're going to be doing a new show today. We've got the striker situation once again to delve into, more reporting around that as we near the January transfer window, which actually isn't that far away. 25 is not that far away now. So we'll delve into that, Nicolas Jackson, Gyökeres, Osimhen, all of that stuff. Then also, and I think we'll start with this, Graham Potter. There's a lot of insight from a podcast interview that Graham Potter did with the High Performance podcast. Very revealing interview, I think very insightful, but a lot to be said about his Chelsea experience, what went wrong, and specifically we'll delve into that mad transfer window and also just maybe the internal issues that Chelsea have. And, you know, have they all gone away? Has it all been fixed by now? It's easy, I think, to say it because this season in particular has started a little bit better. But there's quite a lot to delve into because I think it is worth discussing and addressing and maybe looking back at that period under Graham Potter. So we hope it doesn't happen again at Chelsea, especially under this ownership. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below about those topics. And also like, subscribe as we head near the Christmas period. We're going to have tons of content coming up on the show. I've got a brilliant guest lined up for next week. I've wanted to have this guy back on the show for a long period of time, so maybe we'll speak about and announce who that is sooner to it, but I'm very excited to speak to that person. And as well, of course, we'll be covering the games this week. Heidenheim on Thursday, and then of course Aston Villa on Sunday. Let's delve into the Graham Potter interview. I have to say, I urge all of you, if you're interested in football, if you're interested in, you know, coaches who've, you know, operated at a high level and just kind of want an insight into the game, I think this is a brilliant interview. Yesterday we did at a time, so I was answering your questions, but I knew about 30 minutes into this podcast I'm going to have to speak about it on my show because there's just so much insight. I personally am a fan of Graham Potter. I think he is. I remember reading about him years before he joined Chelsea. Probably around 2019, 2020, I read a book called The Edge, which was all about his time at Östersunds and some of the things he did to really transform the culture of that club. And then obviously he moved to Swansea and Brighton and then obviously eventually Chelsea. And I was pretty positive about him joining Chelsea. Now, of course, it went disastrously wrong and there's a lot of reasons why. We're not going to delve into all of them. If you want to hear my thoughts about Potter's whole time, I think maybe you can go back and find shows when Potter was here. However, I think the more insightful part of the interview was when he spoke about the culture and the relationship with the ownership and also the transfer window. And, you know, I think it is relevant because in the second part of today's show, we're going to be talking once again about transfers and how Chelsea going overboard as they usually do, it feels like, in windows, and that not being the best thing for squad harmony and how that can really impact things. I also think that Graham Potter spoke very honestly about mental health. Because you got to remember, you know, and I think it is something that still is so toxic about the modern game, unfortunately, with social media, is when you get a coach under pressure and is being heavily scrutinised and criticised on a regular basis, it does kind of feel at times like it becomes open season, especially in this new kind of YouTube world where you have very divisive personalities who come on and just want to scream all the time. And it kind of feels like it's open season and kind of anything is allowed to be said because the coach isn't performing well. You got to remember during that period, and they bring it up in the podcast, even death threats were sent to Graham Potter. I mean, just absolute insanity, lunacy that I condemned at the time, and I think many of us did, but it's disgusting. And, you know, obviously that's a part of it. He spoke about tactical mistakes he made, and especially in that first period when things were kind of all right at Chelsea for him. But then he specifically spoke about this transfer window. So let's listen to what he had to say, and then I'll give you my thoughts.
If you change 20, 30 players in 2 or 3 windows, the instability of that is hard to deal with. My point to the owners as well was, if you're going to sign these players, you might need to move some out as well, because otherwise, if you've got 30, only 11 play. So you've got 20 players that aren't happy. As it was, we took a different decision, which is another 7 players. And then you're like, okay, it's not as straightforward that they're going to come in and hit the ground running and get success, because you're buying young players, you're buying players from outside the Premier League, the likes of Mudryk, the likes of Fernandes, the likes of Badiashile. These are young guys that haven't been successful in the Premier League. If you're buying Declan Rice and Harry Kane, I think you've got less argument. But the problem when you're spending that sort of money, especially at Chelsea, that there's a demand that they have to win. You have to win at Chelsea. I have to think that if you go in and you take a sledgehammer to a place and change it that quickly, sometimes there'll be collateral damage.
I think that the curious thing for me now is obviously the change that was kind of made in that January window was that Paul Winstanley and Lawrence Stewart finally came in. And they obviously weren't a part of that opening period with Todd Bowley as interim sporting director. They didn't really have a hand in the Reece James and I think it was Breuer contract negotiations that were done in the summer of that year. Then we get to January, and obviously this kind of connects to Mason Mount, that whole contract situation very rapidly going in the opposite direction, partly due, and I think a lot due to the sporting directors coming in. But, changing that number of players in that short period of time is hard, and that instability is something that is still of concern, I think, to us now, because although right now I think Enzo Maresca is doing a better job than expected. Funny enough, I was having a conversation with Tom Overend on Blue Sky last night. He was looking at some of the data and saying after 10 or 12 games, it's actually looking brilliant for Enzo Maresca. I'm just personally of the belief that I think it's very hard to make that judgment right now, that it was the right decision. I think we will only know that in May, because to me, I've said this before, I'll say it again, I'll say it consistently. My barometer for success this season is Champions League football. If we do not get Champions League football, I don't think the season has been a success. And then you will question what was the change in manager or change in coach for. Separate point, but I think the transfer policy and the chaotic way and the frequent way Chelsea continue to turn over players is something that does concern me in terms of squad harmony, in terms of the actual long-term planning, in the midst of maybe changing head coaches in a frequent way and the muddle that comes from that. It kind of made me think, the more I listened to Graham Potter, that maybe you guys disagree and maybe you are, so anti-Potter or kind of damning of his time at Chelsea that you don't believe this. But I the more I think about that time, the more I think about the sequence of events that led to him even getting the job in the first place and everything that happened since, and kind of his honesty, and I think wanting to be taking a more caring approach and more nuanced approach at a time when Chelsea fans, I think, viscerally were quite angry, frustrated, concerned, and they wanted a leader to kind of attach themselves to, and unfortunately Potter just wasn't that. I think there is a reality at times when sometimes the coach is maybe not the right place, the right guy at the wrong time kind of vibes. I'm not entirely sure Potter is ever right for Chelsea, just because I think the demands of this job is just more than being a good coach. I think you have to be a good communicator. I think it is one of the things you need to be at a top club. However, I just kind of personally think no coach in world football, I really do mean this, could have survived in that environment. So insane, so much turmoil. You got players changing outside the changing rooms because there's just not enough space for all of them after the January window. The sanctions, the cultural kind of change, just instability across the club that really has continued since. I mean, it feels like it's calming down a little bit now, but that has still been going on whilst Pochettino came in, whilst he left. The change behind the scenes, the change with the academy, so much change. It's hard to feel like that stability was ever going to be achievable. And the hope is now we can move into a period of stability. But I do think that Graham Potter does make a good point where it's like, you appoint me. We speak about, sort of my belief to coaching, my belief to this kind of long project that you speak about. And then the moment things start going wrong, we go in a completely opposite direction. That is why, I can't remember who it was, or someone pointing out, maybe commented it, someone brought it up to me, and I think we may have even discussed it, because Enzo Maresca said about a 5-year plan, because obviously he's got this 5+1 year contract, and I just think it's just not a sensible thing to judge coaches that long. I know we have in the recent Premier League era, we have Pep Guardiola's been at Man City for a long period of time. We had Jurgen Klopp just at Liverpool for a long period of time. Arteta, to be fair to him, no matter what you think about his job, has been at Arsenal a decent period of time. And there are other examples. However, we should know as Chelsea fans, we should know as kind of Premier League observers, that thinking in terms of 5 years rather than the next 5 months is kind of naive. I think it is. I that's not what I want to feel and think. And I think there should be some planning and strategy beyond just the next 2 weeks. But in terms of the lifespan of a coach, I think it is a little bit foolish, because as we know how quickly things can change and how quickly people can turn. The people right now saying that Enzo Maresca is doing a fantastic job may have a very different tune if by February Chelsea are no longer in the top four. We've drastically, altered our form and we're really struggling. So that is why I think it's better to have kind of maybe a more chilled view of this. And for Graham Potter, I just want to hear your thoughts. What do you think about his time at Chelsea? What do you think about what he had to say, especially in terms of the transfer window? The other thing I would bring up, and maybe this will instantly relate to the striker discussion that we're about to have, is he spoke about that January window, talking with the hierarchy at Chelsea. He didn't specifically say, I think he kind of inferred it was the ownership, but I can imagine it was also the sporting directors, that they were going for the likes of Benoit Badiashile, Mudryk, Fernandes, young players. And actually, he was trying to stress to them, these are young guys coming from a foreign country most of the time, and to expect them to come into the Premier League halfway through a season in an already kind of chaotic environment and instantly thrive and have this pressure on them is going to be a difficult thing for them to deal with, rather than the name he referenced. And I've heard him say this before in other recent interviews, Declan Rice, who was obviously linked to Chelsea still at the time, and kind of the Premier League quality proven players that can come in that environment, have a bit more experience, and now it's about them who can perform quickly. And maybe that's just kind of his instinct at the time, was I want ready-made players, and that's been something that's been echoed apparently by Mauricio Pochettino. I believe it was probably echoed by Enzo Maresca as well. So that is something to delve into. But I would suggest finally go and listen to the interview, because I think it's really insightful I do think a great football mind. I think Graham Potter will get a good job. And if it's the right fit for him, I think he'll do some good work again. And I think it's a bit of a shame that the madness of Chelsea has kind of warped everything Potter did before then, when he did some really commendable work, I think, at Brighton, at Swansea and Östersund. So those are my thoughts. Let's move on to the striker situation. Still in recent days, Viktor Gyökeres, obviously he's playing for Sporting against Arsenal. If he has a really big performance, that will only heighten his profile, which is ever increasing, especially as we head towards another transfer window. Also, you've got to factor in that Chelsea continually being linked with new strikers. Now, I am very much on the train of, in terms of a big striker, I just don't feel it's that much of a necessity. Simon Johnson wrote a piece about how Jackson is more than making up for Chelsea missing out on Viktor Osimhen. 17 goals and 6 assists in 44 appearances in all competitions last season at age 22. His first at the club following a move from Villarreal for just over 29.1 million. Jackson earned the right to continue to be the club's first choice striker. And then he says, had Osimhen, a more experienced, more proven frontman, arrived, with talks over a loan stepping up in the final days of the window before breaking down, it's hard to see how that would have been the case. He then goes on to speak about Jackson's development, and obviously good coming off the back of another, I think, really good performance against Leicester. But Simon Phillips reporting that noise has increased on Premier League striker interest as Jackson's form continues to rise. Obviously, Alexander Isak has been referenced, Brighton's Evan Ferguson, who has been long linked to Chelsea, another Brighton player linked. And then you've got other names that have been talked about a number of times. I feel like the one that got away for Chelsea, well, there's actually arguably two during the summer that got away, was John Duran from Aston Villa and Samu Omarodian. I think both options at the time, I think I said it at the time, I still kind of believe it based on what I've seen from Duran since, and it may be one of those that's unrealistic at this point because Duran's profile's probably gone up significantly. I think on both cases, those would have been good moves for Chelsea, because I think it would have added a balance of Jackson still being able to be first choice. I think he still would be first choice, but then having at least a really solid rotational option who could come in and compete for minutes. That's exactly what John Duran is giving to Ollie Watkins on a number of occasions. I know maybe his form has slightly decreased in recent weeks, but he had an incredible start to the year that really kind of highlighted why didn't Chelsea go out to sign this guy. And then Samu Omarodian has done quite well at Porto so far, and was also someone that Chelsea looked like they were going to sign, and then obviously it ended up being Joao Felix. And I know people like Joao Felix, but again, I'm thinking in terms of squad necessity. And I've seen this brought up that, if Jackson gets injured, I know the argument would be, and the argument naturally would be for me, well, surely Nkunku just takes that space. But in terms of natural number nines or natural centre forwards, kind of people who can fulfil what Jackson brings as a profile, because it's not just about a guy who can play number 9. It's a guy who can link up with others. It's a guy who physically can deal with the pressure and the adversity of the Premier League that I think Jackson has dealt with very well. Really, there isn't anyone. I mean, Mark Guiu has shown some flashes, but I think he's still very, very raw. And I don't think he's ready to play Premier League football frequently, at least for Chelsea. I don't think he's there yet. I don't think he's even close to there, which is a separate problem. So then if you're moving into the January window and maybe noise crops up again about Nkunku's future and maybe some other players, is there any strikers on the market who fill that bracket of not exactly the star man that you're going to be paying record fees for, that is going to come in and compete with your first choice? That is a very difficult thing. I've brought up this point consistently, is at that time of January when I prefer to get players of Premier League quality, firstly, because you know they can adapt quite quickly. That's what Graham Potter was just talking about. I think that is a smart play, but then also isn't exactly first choice. I mean, is there an Olivier Giroud about of 2018? Giroud at the time was a really good and shrewd piece of business. It was one of Chelsea's best value signings, I felt, for quite a few years. In terms of his rotational ability, scoring goals in Europe, scoring goals in the Premier League, helping out several Chelsea head coaches when we were really struggling for goals. Is there anyone of that ilk? And with a guy like Gyökeres, you've got to understand that if you plough money into him, he is now your first choice. I personally, as me and Jay McIntosh discussed, I'm not entirely sure that's the wisest thing to do, or it's so significantly better than just sticking with Jackson. I think the actual bigger question is, can we find an alternative to Jackson that gives him substantial competition, allows us a bit of a comfort blanket where if he does get injured or he's going to AFCON, we have time and we have a decent option to come in and take those minutes? Or is that Christopher Nkunku? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I just personally, I'm not opposed to signing a striker. I just don't think the big guy is the be all and end all right now, given Jackson's development. So that is it for today's news show. We'll be back tomorrow previewing the Conference League game on Thursday. Let me know your thoughts on everything I discussed in the comments below. Follow me across the socials at SonOfChelsea, and I will see you again very soon. All the best.